In this video, we're going to dive into using Firebase to bring a database into our JavaScript projects. So we are going to learn what Firebase is. We'll talk about Cloud Firestore, which is specifically the service that we're going to be using for our database. And then we will spin up a simple project where we can pull some movie data from a database and put some movie data into a database from JavaScript. So like we did with the API, when we were learning about how to interact with that Poke API, we're going to do this in just regular JavaScript without React, and then we will learn how to port that logic over to a React project. So to start, if you go to firebase.google.com and you click on Docs, you will see a list of products that Firebase contains. So Firebase is the suite of products, one of which is Cloud Firestore, which is the database that we're going to be using, but there's also machine learning and cloud functions and authentication, etc., all listed here. And if you look, you'll see different platforms that each one supports. So for instance, Cloud Firestore you can use on iOS, Android, and the web. And you can see getting started guides for these different platforms that are supported by Firebase. So what that means is that, for the web, Firebase has produced a library that allows you to interact with their services in your JavaScript projects. And same thing for Android. They published a library for Android for you to be able to interact easily with their services. Okay, so from here, I want to go to the guides page, and I want to scroll down on the left side to Cloud Firestore and go to the introduction page. So if you followed along with the Canvas last week, you watched a video from Google that introduces Cloud Firestore. So I'm not going to rehash a lot of that information. I'll do a quick high level here. But Cloud Firestore is a NoSQL cloud database. So this is a database basically as a service where Google is managing the database for us. We don't have to spin up a server somewhere and configure the database software on that server. We're just going to talk to this database's API, ask for some stuff from the database, push some stuff into the database, and it'll make our lives a lot easier for integrating a database into our project for the first time if we don't have to do any of those things, if Google manages it for us. So that's the cloud database part. And then the NoSQL part is that this is not a SQL or SQL database. It's not a database that has strict schemas and has structured query language built into it. So some of the key features. So because this is a NoSQL database, there's a lot of flexibility with what we can put into the database. There's no strict schema imposed on the information that we put in there. So that as we are working on a project and iterating on a project idea, the ability to have a flexible data model can be an advantage because you can just iterate on your database design as your app evolves. It has querying built into it, so it doesn't have SQL, structured query language, but it has its own flavor of querying that you can do. It provides real-time updates, which is one of the reasons why I like Cloud Firestore. So if you're building an application that uses real-time synchronization, like maybe you're making a chat app where you want users to be able to see the messages on their screen the instant that data gets put into the database. You can set up your code to subscribe to a part of the database and get notified anytime things change. So if you subscribe to the sort of messages collection in your database, your code could react the instant that new data is added to that collection. It has some offline support, and it's designed to scale for the other features here. So this was covered in that Cloud Firestore video, but just real briefly, the way that Cloud Firestore is structured for its data model is this document-based database structure. So you're going to have collections in your database, which inside of the collection is going to be a set of documents. So you might have a user's collection, and inside of that is a document for each individual user in your application. And each document might have like a first name, a last name, an email address, whatever else you want to store for that user. So for today, what we're going to do is have a movies collection where we can store individual movies with our own personal ratings of those movies in the database. So from here, we can go to the Getting Started page. And this is what we're going to walk through today. I'm going to show you how to bring this into a Create React App project. This shows us how to set up our development environment, how to set up Firestore, and how to add and read data from a database, from a Cloud Firestore database. Once you go through this, you can step into any of these other pages. So for instance, this page only really shows us the bare bones of adding data. But if you look under Add and Manage Data, there's a page on deleting data so that you can learn, how to go beyond just the basics of putting some data in there, but also learn how to delete some data. And same thing for read data here is the article covers, the Getting Started covers how to get data once, like read all the data in the database once. But there's also a page here on how to listen for real-time updates. So if you want, instead of just to read it once, but to be notified anytime something changes in the database, this is the page to go to. And same here, there's a page on order and limiting data. So how can you make queries to the database that are sorted or where you only get a limited number of entries back. And then there are sections on security, usage limits and pricing. After we go through the Getting Started together, these reference pages will be really important as you're building features in your application. So keep them handy, read through them as you are working on different features. And then the last thing that I want to point out is the API reference. So API, we've seen before with the Poke API, it was us talking from our JavaScript to another server, and the way that it communicated was through an application programming interface, an API. So API is a general term. Sometimes we use it to refer to that communication from our application over the internet to another server. But it also can mean when you just have two pieces of software locally on your machine. Like we're going to bring in the Firestore library, the JavaScript library, and use that in our project. And so the API reference here, if I click on web, tells me about all of the things that come from that Firebase library. So we will dig into this and sort of parse through some of the structure, but this is going to be really helpful once you go past the Getting Started and some of the basics on those guides. If you pull up this documentation, it will tell you exactly what options you have available to you when you have a particular object from the Firebase API that you're working with. Okay, getting started. So we're going to flip back to the guides page, Cloud Firestore, and getting started. And we're going to walk through these steps together. So the first step here is creating a Firebase project. So we're going to go to the Firebase console and click Add Project. Sort of step 0 before you do any of this is you need to have a Google account. So log into your Google account or create a new Google account for creating your Cloud Firestore database. And then go to your console. So console.firebase.google.com. And I am going to switch to my other account. So this is a fresh account that doesn't have any projects. So what I'm going to do here is click on Create a Project. And I will call this Column Code Sprint B. Hit Continue. And if you want, you can add Google Analytics to your project. I am not going to bother setting that up here. I'm going to click Create Project. It's going to take a second. So while this is running, I'm going to flip back over here. So we have done Add a Project. And now what we're going to do is go into that project and go to Cloud Firestore, the Cloud Firestore sidebar section, which allows us to actually initialize that Cloud Firestore service within this project. Okay, so it's finished. We can click Continue, which takes us into this project. And on the sidebar here, under Develop, here are the different services that are part of Firebase. And so specifically, we want to enable Cloud Firestore. So what I'm going to do is click on Cloud Firestore, click on Create Database. And this is the section where we can configure the security rules. Once we get past the basics, we will want to start adding security rules, which controls who is allowed to access this database. But for starting, we're going to start in test mode, which means that basically anyone who knows about the database can put data in and read data from that database. So I'm going to click Next. This one asks you to set your region. I'm going to use Central since that's closest to where I am. Hit Enable. And it'll take a second to set up. While this is finishing, what I'm going to do is flip back to the Getting Started. So we have done step 2 where we enabled Cloud Firestore. We did step 3 where we set it up in test mode. We did step 4 where we selected a location. We're done. And next we are going to actually set up our development environment. So all of these code snippets that you're going to see are separated by platform. So if you're working in Python and you're trying to bring Firebase into your project, this would be the instructions for you. Or if you're working in Unity, here's how you add it to Unity. Specifically, we're doing a web project. And so it's telling us that we can follow the instructions to add Firebase to your web app here. So we'll check that out in a second. And then it's telling us we have two options. We can either include these scripts or we can npm install the Firebase package. And then once we do that, we need to set up Firebase in our project by importing it into the project from that module that we just installed. So before we can set up our development environment, we need to have a development environment. So for this project, we are going to use Create React App, but we're not going to actually use the React part of it yet. We're just going to use this as a simple way to get us a project with a package.json where we can install things using npm install. So I'm going to go into my CodeSprint B folder here, week 2, class materials, open up my terminal here, and do npx create react app, and call this Firestore demo. This is going to take a second to run, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and come back when it's done. All right, that finished setting up, so I can go into my Firestore demo and open this up in Visual Studio Code. And if I open up my terminal in Visual Studio Code, I can run this command to npm install Firebase. So I'm going to just go ahead and grab the latest version of Firebase. This @ here is telling us that this command will pull version 7.24.0. So I can npm install, or I for short, Firebase. This will take a second to kick off, but when it finishes, I should see Firebase show up in my dependencies here, which means that when I am in a JavaScript file inside of this project, I will be able to import Firebase and use it. So I'm going to pause the video while this installs. Okay, so that finished installing, and I should have Firebase here now, 7.24, and I can close package.json. What I'm going to do is grab everything here except for my index.js, delete it, get rid of it, because we're not really worried. Whoops, I just deleted just my index.js. So I'm just going to delete everything here and then create an index.js that is blank. And that's all we need here. So we don't need any of the React stuff. And just to make sure that it's working, I'll do a console.log. Hello from the console, and then npm run start to get this running. And this should pop open in my browser in a second. There we go. So close my terminal, flip back over, open up my DevTools, see hello from the console printing out. So we don't actually need to set up anything with React this time, so it's fine to have a blank index.js that you're working in. The key that we were just using this for is it gives us the build pipeline for our code so that we can install things in package.json and bring them into our project. So what we can do is flip back to our getting started here, and we are going to run something that is similar to this inside of our code. So the import syntax that we've seen before for importing things looked like import Firebase from, and then in quotation marks Firebase. Require is an alternate syntax that's not, it's not a standard syntax in terms of what browsers understand, but it is something that most build pipelines understand, and it's something that comes from the Node.js environment. So we're going to write this in our import syntax. So the structure for taking these requires to import is just import name from whatever is in the parentheses here. And when we have a require that doesn't actually put anything into a named variable, we will just say import and then this string. So I'll show you that. I'm going to copy this over to my project, get rid of this hello from the console. That is the structure that Firebase is suggesting, but I'm going to import Firebase from Firebase. Whoops, this should be Firebase. And then the second thing is import Firebase/Firestore. So what this required for side effects is telling us is that here's the main library, here's the API that we're going to interact with. Once we have that imported, we can do things like firebase.initializeApp to go ahead and set up our application. But any service that you want to use inside of Firebase needs to be enabled by doing this require and then the name of the service. So here we're requiring the Firebase, this should say Firestore. Specifically, we are bringing in the Firestore service to our Firebase library. And remember, Firebase is the suite of tools, so there's a whole bunch of other ones. If you wanted the machine language, you need to be importing that into the application as well. So let's get rid of this, give this a save, and we should, we're going to get some errors here once this finishes, or we're going to get some warnings. The latest version of Firebase is giving us this warning here that we probably don't want to import as we've been importing. So instead of just importing Firebase from Firebase, you can import Firebase from Firebase App, so that you're only importing the pieces that you need to your application. So I'm going to modify what we're doing here, import Firebase, to be import Firebase from Firebase/app, which will make that warning go away, and which will mean that we are only importing the things that we need. So we can flip back to our setup development environment. We are going to go through adding Firebase to our web app now. So I'm going to click this, open this up in another tab. So what this is telling us is that to add Firebase to a JavaScript project, we have to first have a Firebase project. We've already done that. Next, we need to register our application with Firebase. So we're going to have to go into our console again, to our project, and then in the overview page, there'll be a web icon, which will allow us to sort of configure this React project that we just spun up as a project that is registered with Firebase. And when we do that, it'll give us this configuration object down here with our API key, the project ID, other things that we'll need for actually interacting with the database. So this authenticates us and says, yes, you're allowed to have access to these services. So we'll need to get that from our registration process. So this is telling us that if we go to our project, this finished setting up from earlier, we can see our Cloud Firestore, it's empty. But what this is telling us to do is go to the overview page. So go to the overview page here and then click on the web. Or if you go to settings, project settings, and then you scroll down here, you can find that as well. So we're going to click on web to set up a platform. I'm going to name this let's call this the React front end. Register that. And then what that gives us is a API key, an authorization domain, a database URL, project ID, all this stuff that we need to actually use to configure our Firebase project. So don't use mine, because after this video is posted, I'll be deleting these, so these will break for you. What you want to use is your own credentials here. But what you can do is copy this, because we're going to need this when we initialize our application in our code. So I'm going to hit Control-C to copy it. I'm going to let this go back to the console And you can see that still, if you go to your settings, general, you can see that config at any point. So if you needed to find it later, you'd be able to grab it. And this lets you flip between two different modes, one where you can just see the config. And actually, I'm gonna just copy this, make sure I got it. Fly back to my JavaScript, drop in my configuration. And if we look through here, we've reached the end of the docs here for bringing in Firebase to our JavaScript project. So I'm going to close that down and look at the next step inside of the Getting Started page, which it tells us we need to initialize our app. So we imported Firebase. We need to call the function here, initialize app, and pass in that configuration. And once we do that, we can ask for Firestore from that Firebase library. And that database will give us a way to add things to our database and remove things from our database. So if I flip back here, this config, what I need to do is do Firebase dot initialize app with that Firebase config. And then I can create the database by saying database dot Firebase Firestore. So just bringing in these lines of code into our project. And if I print out the DB here, I should be able to see something in my console that has a bunch of methods and properties. So these are the things that we can interact with in Firebase. So let's flip back here. And I think I want to actually do these out of order. I want to show you how to add some data to your database through the web browser and then read it. And then we'll look at how to actually add something new to that collection from JavaScript. So we're going to pick up here, but first we're going to take a detour back to our project, and we go to Cloud Firestore. And this is where we can, right now it's empty, we can create a collection. So for this application, we're going to do like a movie rating app where we could keep track of how we felt about different movies. So I could start a new collection here and give that collection an ID of movies. And what it's asking me to do once I've created that collection is add the first document to that collection. And remember, collection is like your folder and documents are your individual entities that have data. So in this case, a document would be a specific movie. We got a couple of options here. So one, we can type in an ID for that movie, which is its unique identifier. Or what I recommend doing for this is just clicking audio ID, which is going to give you a unique identifier for that document. And then we can start filling in the fields. So let's say we want to store the title. This will be the name of the field. We can pick what type it is. Here are the types that are built into Firestore. So we can store strings, numbers, booleans. We can store objects, or in Firebase lingo, maps, geopoints. We can have references to other things. So we're going to store a title, and I'm going to pull some movies from the top movies from Rotten Tomatoes. So maybe I'll grab Get Out and use some of the movie info down here to fill this out. Close that tab. So the title here would be Get Out, and we don't need quotation marks around it since this is indicating that this is a string. So we store that field title. Then if we click add, we can add another one. So let's do the release year and store that as a number. And if we look here, this was released in 2017. So release year 2017. Let's add a number, which would be our rating. And let's say that the application is going to have ratings from 1 to 5. So maybe, I like to Get Out, so maybe I'll give it a 5 here. And then we can hit save. And now we have our collections listed here. So if we had multiple collections, like we had movies and users collections, and the users would be storing the accounts and the account information, those would be listed here. We only have one, so if we click on it, we can see all the documents in that collection, and each one has individual data associated with it. So we've got rating, release year, title, all under this document. And what we can do is add more documents to this collection. So if I hit add document here, it's going to give me that same prompt. So I'm adding something to /movies. So I'm adding something to that movies collection. I'm going to hit auto ID, and then I'm going to grab another one. So let's see here. I liked Coco a lot, so maybe I will grab that. Okay, open up in a new tab so that the ads will load and it will not complain. So Coco, let's say, came out in 2017. So let's flip back here. We need to make sure that these titles, that we choose the same names. This will make our JavaScript life a lot easier if they match exactly. So you don't want to name it title with a capital T. We want to keep it consistent. So title, lowercase t, Coco. Add a field here for release date, or called it release year. And this is a number, and we saw that that was, I've already forgotten, 2017. And then let's add a rating, which is a number, and I'm going to put in a 4 and save it. So now we've got this database that has 2 documents in it, one for Coco and one for Get Out. You can, inside of this interface, change aspects of the data. So if you came back and you're like, well, no, it wasn't a 4, it was a 3, and save it, you've now just edited that document inside of your database. Let me change it back to a 4. You can also add fields to specific documents. So here I could maybe add a genre field, and this is animated. And this is one of the things that a NoSQL database allows you to do, is have, some NoSQL databases allow you to do, which is not impose a strict schema. So here, I have rating, release year, title, that's fine. And here I've got those same things, but I was allowed to add a genre here, even though it's not in here. So this means that you have to code a little bit more defensively in terms of your applications, but it also affords you a lot of flexibility in that you can add things and remove things at will and change your database design as your app evolves. So I'm going to get rid of that genre. And I guess two other things to point out before we flip back to our getting started. You can delete a document up here. Delete document will delete this document completely. And over here, over here, you can delete the whole collection of movies, which would delete all of these documents. So I'm not going to do that. I want to leave some data in here that we can pull down. And maybe for completeness sake, I'm going to add one more movie here. So let's grab Logan from 2017. So auto ID, title, Logan, add a field, release year. Did I pick another one from 2017? I did. Okay, all of these are from 2017. And then a rating. Make sure this is a number. 2017, and this is also a number. Let's give this a 4. Save it. So we got 3 things in here. So now we could actually learn how to bring these down in our JavaScript project. So if I flip back to getting started, I can see this is how we read data. So we have that database object. Let me flip back to the code. This database object that we got returned from calling Firestore. And this database object here, we can access a collection and then call .get. And then we can see something familiar. We have a .then. So that means that our .get here, what that's doing is initiating a promise that goes off to this collection and pulls it down into our project. So we're going to do this. Let's flip back to our code here. And let's, we're going to call this our movies snapshot and set it equal to db.collection movies. And this name needs to exactly match what our collection is that we created in the browser. So that's the ID that we created. .get. You know what, let's name this a little bit more specifically. This is the movie snapshot promise. And let's print that out to the console. So when we run, we can see promise is pending. Actually, if you expand it, at the time that I expand it, that checks the promise again, and we can see that it's fulfilled. So that promise is equivalent to this part of the code snippet. I'm just pulling it out into a variable. And what we're going to do with that promise is chain a .then that runs this function, which gets a snapshot back. And then that snapshot we can do some things with, like we can read all of the documents that are in that collection. So let's basically just do this code that we've got here. I'm going to copy it over for reference. And we're going to update it slightly as we write it ourselves. So bringing this in, commenting it out. So we have the promise here. Then we can go ahead and do our .then. And we have a snapshot that gets returned to us, whoops, inside of this then, which will allow us to read something from that data. So with that snapshot, we can do a for each one, each element in this snapshot is a document. And we can, for instance, print out the doc.id here. And if we save it and flip back to our browser and see, we've got these jumbles of letters and numbers, which actually correspond to these numbers here, these IDs. So we've got unique identifiers for each element that was pulled. And then we can also console.log doc.data here. So this is that other piece of this code snippet. Each document has a method called .data, which allows you to extract all of the data into a regular object that you can inspect and use in your project. So here, if we run it, we can see the first one that got pulled back was our entry with a rating of 4, release year of 2017, title of Logan. And then get out and Coco. For completeness, let's also, do our catch. So I can say .catch error. Let's throw it to the console. So in case this promise failed for some reason, we would end up down here and print something out to the console. And reasons why it might fail would be, the network connection disappears, something buggy happens with the underlying library. But if this collection, like if I made a typo here, you might think that that would cause an error, but what that actually does is just return an empty snapshot to you because there is no MOV collection in the database. So Cloud Firestore is a little bit permissive here. It allows you to add new collections and read from non-existing collections without causing an error. So as you're working, that's a good thing to keep in mind. If something unexpected happens, you're going to have to do a little bit more debugging to try and figure out what's going on. Like here, to find this typo, what I would do is print out my snapshot to see what is actually going on here and be able to, if I go through some of the snapshot, like snapshot.docs will give me all of the elements in there. I can see that it's an empty array. And then I would be like, well, I know my database actually has stuff in it from the browser, so this must be the problem. My collection isn't right. So what I want to do is, we pulled their code down And I adjusted some of what we're doing slightly so that it's not exactly what they showed us in that code snippet, but I want to pull up the documentation, the API reference, so that we have a place where we can look to sort of understand technically what we can do at each stage of this code snippet. So if we go back to our Getting Started guide and then look in the API reference, I'm going to open this in a new tab, the web reference. Under here, we can see all of the things that come with Firestore. So this Firestore method, so we can tell that it's a function or a method because it has this word here, callable, which means that it can be invoked and we can pass in an optional parameter. But this is what we called here. That's the documentation that corresponds to what we did there. So we can see that from this compressed syntax, here are the parameters, and after the colon is what it returns. So it returns something called a Firestore, which I can also see in the sidebar here. So if I click on Firestore, this will take me to that documentation page, and this is it's a class, and so it's an object in terms of when we have access to our DB here. This is where we sort it. It's going to have properties and it's going to have methods. So properties would be pieces of data that we can access via dot notation. So we could say db.app to access the app, and then it's going to have methods that we can invoke. So we saw the collection method here that we invoked here. We said db.collection. And so if we click on that, it will take us to the documentation for that collection. And it's telling us that collection, that method, takes a string parameter and then returns what is called a collection reference. So this is giving us a collection reference. So if we want to know what .get is, we can look at the collection reference documentation. So if I click on that, it's telling us that this is an object that can be used for adding documents, getting documents from references, and querying for documents. And we can see the get method. If I click on that, it tells us that this is a method. It takes some options that are optional. That's what the question mark means, and returns a promise. And inside of the less than, greater than signs is what the promise resolves to. So it gives us a query snapshot. So what the get does is actually executes the query that we've constructed and return a snapshot. So this sets up a query. So we're asking, like, go get us the movie collection. .get is what actually goes off and executes it. So it kicks off the promise and gives back to us this snapshot when that promise resolves. So if we click on query snapshot, we can see what a snapshot has in it. So again, these are going to be classes that have properties and methods. So we haven't really talked a ton about classes. I'm being a little hand wavy with referring to objects and classes similarly, but for the purposes of knowing what to do here, just know that it's going to have properties that you can access and methods that you can access. So a query snapshot contains 0 or more document snapshots. So we talked to a collection, which potentially had multiple documents in it. So what it's giving back to us is a snapshot that contains all of those documents. And there's a property called docs. If I check it out, we can see that this gives us an array of all the documents. There is a empty property, which tells us true or false. Were there any documents there? And then there's that for each method, which we were using, which gives us the ability to loop over those documents. So another way that we can do this, since we saw that there's this docs property, instead of doing for each, we can say our docs is equal to snapshot.docs. So we're grabbing that property here, which is an array of document snapshots. And we can, for const doc in or of docs, and print out the doc.id and doc.data. And check it out, and okay, well, we got a promise, and it seems like it fulfilled, which means that I could print out some stuff here, but I can just, looking at the code, tell that, oops, I forgot to say movies up here. Save that, and we get the same thing printing out. So we've got our array now that we could work with and do whatever we want. So we could call map on this when we get into React land to put these docs on the page, whatever we want now that it's just a basic array. And then last thing that I want to unpack here is we've sort of traced all these bits through the API except for this doc. So if we look back at the docs here, this docs prop is an array, and in brackets it tells us what it is. It is a query document snapshot. If I click on that, now I can see that this allows us to read data from a specific document. And again, it's an instance of a class. So it has a couple properties. It has the ID. It has a Boolean property, whether or not that document exists. And then it has this data property here, which is retrieving all the fields from the document as an object. So when we have a snapshot of a document, we will be calling that data to actually get the fields from that entry, from that document. So this is fine as a structure, but we did learn how to use async and await with promises. So this is a promise, so we can easily convert this to a async function that says get all movies, or that's called get all movies, and into this we can do our try catch structure and console.log the error here, and inside of the try we want to do this structure, but we don't have to have our .then chained on here. We can await that promise, so we could say directly the snapshot is equal to await, and then we can put in our promise. So this is the thing that gives us that promise. So we can say snapshot equals await all of this, and then once we've got that snapshot, we can bring over this code here that was pulling the docs, looping over the docs. So let's go ahead and comment this code out and call get all movies. And this should do the same thing. So our site should be functionally the same here, where we're printing out all that data from the database. We have just gone through taking their snippet, converting it into our own way of writing things, where we've been preferring to use async and await. And let's wrap up with, if we flip back to the browser, getting started guide. We're going to leave this securing data alone, but we'll do this add data. So we can add something to our database by specifying a collection here and then calling the add method, which allows us to put into the parameters what fields we want to add. So if we wanted to trace this, we know that this gives us back, if we flip back to Firestore, which is our DB variable, when we call collection, that gives us a collection reference. So this is giving us a collection reference. And then the add method, if we want to look that up, here is saying adds a new document with the specified data, and it assigns a document ID automatically. So we don't have to actually pass in an ID. It will give us in our database a unique ID for that entry when it is inserted into the database. So let's do this, but let's not do this in the same structure that they're doing here. We're going to bring this directly into an async function. So let's create a function that is async called add movie. And I'm going to paste in their code for reference just so that we have something to look at. We are going to create a try catch block. So try catch, and with that error, we are just going to console log errors for now, but when we get into React, we will actually handle those and do something a bit more graceful. The console logging is just so that we can see them in the console and figure out what's going wrong as we go through the development cycle. So in here, what we do is we can see that it's doing database.collections to get that collection reference. So db.collection movies. And then the add here is adding something to that database, but it is, we can tell from looking at this code, a promise because .then and .catch have been chained onto it. So we can specify a movie to add here. And the way that we're going to do this is by using the same keys as we did in our browser. So here, title, let's say we want to add the movie Alien. And we need the release year, and this needs to match exactly what we did in the database in the browser. Well, sorry, this technically does not have to exactly match, but if we make a typo here, it'll make our lives a lot harder when we actually try to pull this stuff down from the database and sort of parse it. If one of these is called release date and the others are called release year, then you're going to have a mess when it comes to displaying that information in our React application. So here, this was 1979, and we need a rating. And let's put in 4 for the rating. Make sure we got a comma in here. So this gives us back a promise. So we can await this. And what that gives us, we can tell from looking at this code snippet, is a reference to that document that was just added to the page. So we can say const doc equals this promise. So if this resolves successfully, we will have a reference to that document, and we can do stuff like we did here. We could print out the doc ID, let's say console.log, successfully added new movie. Print out the ID, print out the contents of what we just added. And if it fails, we'll get this error message printing out in the console. Let's go ahead and get rid of this code snippet. One problem that we'll run into is because we have hot reloading enabled with this Create React App project, as soon as the page reloads and we sort of call this add movie function, every time it refreshes, it's going to throw another alien into our database. So just for the sake of demo purposes and make sure that we don't fill that database with alien a bunch of times, let's get the document.body and add event listener. So if someone clicks on the body, we'll call add movie. This will just make it so that this is nice in the hot refreshing version of our application. Let's flip back to our Cloud Firestore here. Currently, there are just those 3 movies in the database. But if I go to my application and I click, and then I go back to my database, refresh this page. Whoops, I think that if I go back to my code, I may not have saved this. Oh, nope. You know what's happening? Because I'm not seeing anything print out. I'm not seeing successfully added a new movie, and I'm not seeing error. That's telling me that this function's not being called. And if I look at how big my body is, because it's an empty page, I would have to click all the way up here for this to work. So let's just, we'll make a button show up on the page. So let's do, or actually we'll make this easier on us. Let's do this in our index.html in the public folder. So we're just going to throw a button here that says add movie and give it an ID of add movie button. Flip back to my index.js, and we want to get that button using query selector. Document.querySelector. Use that ID. Whoops, needs to be hash add movie button, and then we will use the button on click. So add event listener, click, add movie. And remember, this stuff that we're doing here, this is the vanilla, the sort of regular JavaScript way of talking to things that are on the page. We leave this behind when we enter into the React world, basically, and we rely on React to allow us to add click handlers and put things on the page. So this is really just demo purposes. Okay, so we've got our button. If I click add movie, we can see successfully added new movie. We can see that ID. We got an error here, so I made a mistake in the coding, but let's check out the database. We can now see that alien has been added and has been given that unique ID. So let's deal with that error. So let's look at type error doc.data is not a function. And yes, okay. So while I was coding, I made a little bit of a mistake. The doc here is slightly different than the doc here. So when we call the add method from our collection, let's just look at the docs again here. So we got our collection reference. We call this add. What we get back is not a document snapshot, which has the data in it. It's a document reference. So the document reference just sort of points to that location where the document is, but doesn't actually get the data for you. And if we look at it, we can print out the ID and the path where that data exists. And if we wanted that data, we could call get, or if we wanted to delete it, we could call delete. But there is no data method here. That's something that exists on document snapshots. So here, instead of printing out data, we could do like document.path to print out that movie. So let me delete this from here and flip back to the application, refresh it, hit add movie, and now it's added. And instead of getting that error, we're seeing, oh, here's where it's stored. It's in movies / and then that ID. And if I look at my database, we can see alien is now in here. Okay, so that was, a lot of concept, even though it was not a ton of code. So it's helpful for us to review as we're finishing this off. What we learned how to do is get stuff from a collection. So that's what we wrote in Get All Movies, and how to add something to a collection. So how to add a document to a collection. And these are kind of the basics that will allow us to then create a React application that does these things. So we hard-coded this add movie function to specifically just add the alien movie. And if I keep clicking that button, it's going to keep adding alien to the database over and over again. So what we want to do when we move this into React is make sure that these fields can be filled in by input elements. As opposed to this is like a super simple demo of just how to work with the database, not how to hook it up to a user interface. And we saw that the code is pretty simple for doing either of these things, but the concepts involved, there are a lot of concepts involved. So pulling up that API documentation will help you as you're going through and being like, oh, okay, so this is a collection reference. What does the get method of the collection reference do? And that will tell you, what the snapshot is that we're using here. And then if you look at the docs property, what is that? What things do I have available to me here when I'm looping over each doc? So having that API reference in addition to the guides will help you as you're working on your Firestore applications. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. What we'll be doing next time is bringing some of this into React and learning how to, when a component mounts, load all of the movies and put them on the page, or how to create an interface that allows us to, with a form, input things into the database.